This is a report that has a wide footprint, if you will. It goes all the way to Morocco in the west and then to the heart of Central Asia with Kazakhstan and all points in between, of course. And no matter where you zoom in, right, there's trouble there. And particularly for the large Middle East oil exporters that are highly dependent on oil revenues to survive. I would put Iraq at the top of the list. Of course, Saudi Arabia is kind of in the same position, even though they're pushing diversification. And one thing we do know that when the pandemic hit back in April, we saw oil demand drop by nearly 30%. We've seen a recovery to a drop of, say, 9 to 10% for all of 2020. That's the expectation. But that is still extremely deep. And the challenge is we don't know when it's going to recover. Let's listen to Jihad Azur of the International Monetary Fund, who chaired the report.
The recovery of oil will be dependent on various factors. The first is demand. Demand has been playing an important role, and the uncertainty about the recovery globally is affecting the expectations about demand, especially since trade is expected to drop by 12% globally.
A 12% drop in trade is unheard of, Becky. As you know, you can't even go back to the global financial crisis and find that. The one advantage for the Gulf states where we're based here is the amount of sovereign wealth, some $2 trillion. The IMF flagged it about 6 months ago that that's depleting rapidly, but it came in handy right now because the budget deficits, again, no matter where you look, 8 to 10% of GDP. So it's trouble, but for those who have that financial cushion, it makes a huge difference, of course.
Yeah, and players like the Gulf states, some players like the Gulf states, of course, have reserves, as you suggest. But what are the risks for those who don't, and which countries are we looking at here?
Yeah, let's call these the ones that don't have the rainy day funds, if you will. There's 4 acute ones that the IMF, I know it's politically sensitive, right, to talk about it, but they did flag it. I would put Iran on that list, of course, because it has a triple whammy: high COVID cases, U.S. sanctions, and the drop in oil prices. Lebanon, because right in the midst of protests again and the financial crisis, so it's a political and financial crisis, and they did not advance the talks with the IMF as of last Friday. I would also single out here Iraq and Libya as failed states, Becky, right, because they don't have the infrastructure within the government to deal with these sort of challenges right now. Oil prices are low and the medical systems are strained. So let's bring up kind of the COVID-19 challenges according to the International Monetary Fund. They call it a double whammy because you have oil prices under pressure and you could be facing additional lockdowns in the second wave, which could lead to protests. This is very acute and something that's alarming. Oil revenues down. Becky, this is an extraordinary number, $270 billion 2020 versus 2019, and OPEC may open up the spigots a little bit here and dial back on some of the cuts so we could see downward pressure here in the fourth quarter. We're not clear yet. And finally, this is something that I did not know until I looked at the report, that the stimulus plans in this part of the world are the lowest, no matter where you look, during the pandemic. So if we have a second wave and you're not one of the Gulf states with sovereign wealth, you're going to have trouble keeping things under control. And all of those countries I was talking about before had protests before the pandemic, right? And that's the risk that the International Monetary Fund singled out here today as a real challenge going forward if we have a second wave.